Hi there and welcome. This is Derrick Feldmann. I'm excited to be with you for the next hour talking about the Millennial Impact Report this year and politics and millennial cause behavior. Thanks for joining us over this lunchtime, or maybe it's earlier wherever you are. We'll spend our time together in three different parts. The first part we're going to talk about is how we set up the Millennial Impact Project report this year and the research itself. The next part, we'll talk about some of the key trends that we're discovering. And of course, we'll also talk about after that some questions that we are also wondering as well as we go through our continuation of the research between the point that we released this research all the way until the end of the year. I'll be sharing the presentation with you, so no need to take feverish notes. We'll make sure and get those to you as well. In addition, this is being recorded, so if there is anything that you miss, you can always go back to it at any time. We'll send those after this session, midweek this week, for you to also have and share with your teams internally as well. For some of you may not know, we are Achieve, the research team that I lead with my colleagues here, provide research and knowledge for the field on how millennials engage with causes. Actually, the research has been underwritten and supported by the Case Foundation since we began the project, since 2009. And our primary goal is, with the Millennial Impact Project, is to try and understand the why and how of what millennials do with and for causes. As we look at cause behavior and how that has shifted and changed over time with this particular demographic, we've been able to note some common trends and things that we've seen that for us are worth noting, of course, over time, but in particular, things that change in relevancy and things that happen in certain years that are far more important than others. Because as researchers, we have to look at what are those things that greatly influence the incentivized behavior, the non-incentivized behavior, the real reason why somebody does something or not. So to get to the why, we have to look at all of those relevant scenarios that have actually happened. I'm proud to say that actually since 2009, we've had more than 75,000 individuals participating in the studies, and you can find all of the research reports available at the millennialimpactproject.com. In this study, it was interesting because this study in particular was something that, as we started to see what happened in the political landscape, it was imperative for us to look at how the politics and the discussion, the discourse, the pieces that are occurring in and out of each party was going to affect engagement with causes and social issues. Obviously, we had certain things that we wanted to quite understand this year. As most of you know, the election in and of itself has its own piece, but we want to determine whether or not that election piece can affect all of the other social issue or cause behavior that actually happens too as well. So as you can see on your screen, we had these questions going in. I mean, primarily in an election year, does cause and social engagement with social issues change? And although that we have produced research in other election years, 2012 in particular, we didn't necessarily make note of it during that time, nor did we spend an immense look into the politics and whether or not it occurred that year. But this year in particular, we felt it was going to be hard to ignore in general as we come out with our annual research. And in addition to that, we wanted to understand what factors actually make this engagement happen. And if any, are there any demographic factors that are also connected to certain trends? And then essentially for the nonprofit field, nonprofit organizations themselves, can any organizations, nonprofits in particular, use this information to help inspire activation and involvement with the generation in their social issues too? So all of these questions have been at the forefront as we've designed the methods, the inquiries, as well as the different phases of research altogether. So it's important that we spend some time together talking about that methodology, because this year was way different than any other year that we've done this study. Historically, the way that we have studied this is that we would do some quantitative phases of research. Then we would validate those with qualitative measures and qualitative inquiry with subsets of that quantitative population. Sometimes there would be panel tracking and behavior tracking too as well. All of those things led itself to us producing the Millennial Impact Report every year. In addition, we provided updates to everybody as to what things that we've learned from those qualitative phases or other panel tracking pieces that we have done. This year we knew it would be a little different because we couldn't necessarily say that if we went to quantitative at one part of the year, when say there were 13 candidates on the Republican side and maybe 2 or 3 on the Democratic side, whether or not that could hold true throughout the year as well. So how we designed this particular study this year alone is way more intense than we've ever done before, which has also led us to unique opportunities to study in real time what we're starting to see with the populations that are in our studies overall. This is how we did it. We have been looking at 3 total waves of quantitative methods. Every month, we have been surveying a subgroup. And that subgroup, in addition to the next month and the month after, produces what we call a wave 1 total population. Each month, we have been determining whether or not those subgroups, their attitudes or perceptions and involvement is changing over time. So right now, what's kind of interesting is that you're actually in the middle of the study with us right now, because it's obviously July heading into August, and we're in the middle of wave 2. Today, I'm going to be reporting and talking about wave 1, what we learned from the first 3 months. And it seems like an eternity ago, but from wave 1, we had more candidates in the Republican side, and obviously we had other candidates in the Democratic side too as well. And then in addition to that, social issues and relevancy issues have changed in that course of time. Things like the Paris incidents and others occurred during these waves, so it can affect some of the response rates too as well. So our goal is every month, let's see what changes, if at all, anything. And then we'll report what it was like in the first 3 months to you. And then in the end, of course, we're going to be doing even more. So as you can see here, these were the different survey times that we did in wave 1. 1,050 unique and unrepeated respondents that were in each different survey group. Wave 2, we're going to be doing the same thing, June, July, and August. And then in addition to that, in wave 3, we'll finish up right before the election. And of course, our job is to figure out whether or not these attitudes, perceptions, and cause behavior change overall during the election cycles. In addition, right after the election, we're going to be doing some follow-up qualitative methods and inquiries with the populations that went through our studies. We'll be doing some post-interviews to determine how they voted, whether or not they've been involved with causes, how in effect that has changed too as well. All leading up to a bigger report that comes out in January, much more aggregate and comprehensive in general. So as we go through each one of these, know that today's discussion is primarily focused on just that wave 1. And as we go through, and as you can see that's on your screen right now, this is the full methodology if you look at it all into the different pieces. And our job at the end of all of this will be, how did the behavior, perceptions, and attitudes change as the election got near, what happened at the election and right after, and whether or not that had any effect on the millennials and their cause behavior as they went throughout this particular year in general. So pretty exciting study in the fact that you're right in the middle of it, and being right in the middle of it, also we have one other thing to realize, is that as we're going through this, as the research team, myself, Dr. Amy Thayer, Melissa, and Elena, and others who are all part of the research team, is that we start to begin to look at this from different angles. And we're reporting today to you not only what we found early on in the first wave, but also reporting to you what are some questions and things that are coming out of that wave that we need to investigate further, especially when we get into those qualitative phases. And always open to hearing from you. What, based upon what you hear today, or based upon the different waves in general, what are you also wondering about? Because we have a chance to go to the populations that are part of our studies to ask them deeper and deeper questions into this. So as I mentioned, Wave 1 was conducted over March, April, and May of this year. And today will be a discussion on those wave one pieces. We had about 1,050 respondents overall. And as you can see, some of the demographic pieces there too, and how they laid out. Of course, millennial age being different cohorts within the larger population between 18 and 35. So here are the major trends. This is where we're going to spend most of our time together. And by the way, if you'd like to, go ahead and share your thoughts at hashtag Millennial Impact. We will be following that and also sharing our thoughts too along the way. So hashtag Millennial Impact. The trends worth watching. This is how we compiled this section and area. In looking at the first wave, things that were what we would say common each month during that time frame, April, March, and May, or March, April, May, sorry. And then in looking at those trends, we are obviously determining whether or not those trends will hold true even as we get into wave two, and especially now, given that post-convention and the actual candidates who we know. Because as you'll see in here, we have data on Ted Cruz and different politicians that were part of the political system in the political cycle here, pre-convention. And so we're gonna try and dissect these trends over time. But these are the things that we noticed in looking at the first 3 months, March, April, May, and what we discovered that are worth continuing to delve deeper into as we go along. First and foremost, millennials as part of our study, we're more interested and the most interested in education, healthcare, and the economy. The three major pieces that we had seen that came out across all of the actual months and the individuals that were part of that study. If you look at how that compares those three social issues, you can see crime, criminal justice, human rights were close on there, employment, wages too as well. Race and cultural relations was at a 7%. Student loans were at an 8%. But the economy, education, and healthcare. Now, some of you may be wondering, Derrick, these seem like broad-based terms at times. And of course they are. And we'll be diving deeper into those over the course of the study and also into the qualitative. So in terms of, say, education, is there a particular area in education too? Now, of course, there are more recent events that have happened since March, April, and May that could make things like race and cultural relations spike higher. And we'll be reporting and talking about that later on, or human rights issues, as well as national security, which came in at 15% on average between those 3 months. Overall, in the first 3 months, millennials, that we had economy, education, and healthcare. What's also interesting, if you look by the social issues and by the candidate's preference, so these are millennials who said, these are the candidates I'm interested in, you can see the top 3 particular issues per candidate during those 3 months. And as you see with Hillary, it was education, healthcare, and employment. And even with Bernie Sanders, it was education, human rights, and environment, where we saw the difference primarily versus all the others. National security with Ted Cruz, as well as national security with Donald Trump, were higher on those lists and categories than we had seen with the Democratic pieces, or the Democratic candidates too. So you can see the interest by social issues and by candidates. Overall, education by Hillary Clinton, economy by Donald Trump. You look in those categories of healthcare as number 2, and then national security on Trump on number 3, and employment and wages with Hillary Clinton. Of course, these will probably and likely change as we get into the next wave, but worth noting during the March, April, May timeframe. So this led us to some interesting questions for our own research team as we were looking at the analysis and the aggregate, and some things that we're going to delve deeper into as we get into the other phases of the study. First, do each of these specific areas within the overarching social issues that are important with millennials, are there deeper divides and niche areas? Because probably as nonprofit causes, you might be working on education, but a separate subsection of education. Maybe it's the K-12 piece, maybe it's college as well. So we automatically, in looking at the broad-based areas in which identify by millennials as part of this study, we're going to be going through and determining which particular areas we think are, based upon their responses, that we need to look deeper into and help everybody understand where their interests are. Another big question that we've been coming up to is, how might these social issues change or stay the same in the election season as it advances, and in particular, current and relevant events? Obviously, since since this time frame of May 30th, so June, July, we have had several terrorism incidents and several other issues occurring in the United States related to race relations and others. And although they had also happened during that time too, we have newer ones. And so at the time of when the studies are released or the surveys are released for for responses, those things can affect those. So we're greatly interested too in this moment as to see how these individuals react and respond to those particular social issues based upon relevant events. In addition to that, and as I'll report later on, some of their activities, did they do anything about it? Because right now, obviously, one of the ways in politics to do anything is vote for the candidate that represents your thinking and views upon it. But in addition to that, for the nonprofit space and cause space, did they donate? Did they volunteer? Did they participate in activism roles and advocate in some way, shape, or form? Trend 2, which is a little interesting because it maybe goes against some of the conventional wisdom that we may have had right now, but something worth watching too as well. In the millennials that were part of our study, they actually identified a little bit more conservative leaning than liberal. And you might be asking, how is that possible? So what happens is on a sliding scale, the individual had to move themselves across based upon where they viewed themselves within issue areas and how it identified them as an individual political affiliation. And when we did that political affiliation, we actually discovered that a little higher identified in the conservative area, but we had others in the neutral category. Of course, that was again potentially that we had a lot more candidates in there. And so the 7% that were neutral could have shifted towards the Republican Party or towards the Democratic Party as well, something that we'll be watching as we go forward. But it was really interesting to note that this actually brought up a broader sense of what is the definition of conservative and liberalism in the United States, and what values do they actually represent in ideologies. We look at the traditional forms of the definition, and does that definition actually hold the same? And do millennials define it that way in particular? So not necessarily us just saying, well, now this is the new conservatism or this is the new liberal, but actually going through, and we'll be doing this in the qualitative phases as well, is how do you as the millennial define each of these categories and seeing common ground? The second thing is will these change, of course, based as we get further through the election? During that time during the first wave, we had a lot more candidates. And so some candidate views, when you have a lot of different candidates, Bernie versus Hillary, you have very opposing views on the extent of liberalism. And then in the same thing, we also saw that in the conservative candidates as well, where we had many different views in the larger conservative movement. So again, understanding, do these percentages change, and do the ones that would identify as more conservative leaning actually become more conservative leaning, or do they remain neutral as well? Something that we'll be watching as we go forward. This is the interesting thing around the nonprofit cause space for all of you that are working in the field. We discovered in some of the trust issues and questions is that they only, and the activism questions, is that they only somewhat believe they are actually activists. When looking at it by ideologies, in particular, we saw some interesting pieces here where activism by political ideology at times was higher in the conservative side than in the liberal, than neutral. And in terms of activism, meaning, you can be an activist for a social issue or a social cause, which led us to some additional questions, which is around, what are the characteristics in which that someone views themselves as an activist? So we discovered, and you're probably seeing a little bit of a trend here, is that we're making a notation that the individual, our traditional forms of definitions, potentially could get changed in this election field, and how somebody defines themselves as a supporter of a social issue or a cause. And some of that might be a little bit different than how we've traditionally defined you as an activist or a conservative individual or a liberal individual. And what we want to look at is, if they only somewhat believe they're activists, does that mean that in the terms of the definition that exists today, they only see themselves somewhat in that role? Or does or in general, what does the term activism mean to them, and whether or not that they're coming at it from a different perspective? definitely something to watch for. And of course, if they only consider them somewhat active or activists in this role, how do they think they can create change going forward? The trend four is that most millennials believe people like them can actually have an impact in the US, which is a very positive piece, especially given that in terms of the discussion around doing more for good and going beyond just some of the forms of smaller types of activism, passive activism that we may be seeing in social networks and so forth. But there is a higher belief that they can have a bigger impact, or at least an impact in some way, shape, or form than not, which is a very positive. So we have an opportunistic generation, of course, that we've seen. And in addition to that, this opportunism that exists with the demographic can be something that, if positioned from a marketing and nonprofit standpoint, can have a great effect. For instance, not necessarily talking about challenges existing, but where that person individually can make a difference would be really important. In other ways, might millennials be creating change or having an impact in the U.S., making the U.S. a better place to live? And when we were going through some of the areas in this research, particularly around having an impact on social issues or social life in the United States, we are particularly interested in what is that individual, where do they define that impact at? It's local, geographical. In past reports that we have found, we discovered that the very hyper local environment, neighborhoods, 1 to 2 mile radius is in and around where the millennial lives, work, and plays, is something they want to affect, in addition to affecting a larger global issue in some way, shape, or form. But it's also where they live, work, and play. But how does that translate into the global effect as well? And what are important characteristics to millennials really making the US better is something that we're going to be investigating too. The majority of millennials have little or no trust that the government will do what is right. Now, we looked at, these are not necessarily just trust questions that we created. These were trust questions that were used in multitudes of other studies that we incorporated into our study methodologies as well. And as we noted here in this report section, and also now in the trend, is that the vast majority, the trust factor had actually gone down within the government in particular. This is not about the nonprofit sector, nor is it about any of the institutions in and around that are working on social cause issues, but in particular government as it relates. And as you can see, the trust factor is trusting them only a little, trusting them not at all was more than 50%, and others preferred not to answer. And so because there's only some trust, some of them, and trust them a lot was very, very low, that's something we want to monitor and see if that has changed as the new candidates actually come into as well, to determine whether or not trust factors will change based upon candidates that have been selected as the candidate of choice, obviously, for each of the parties. So as it advances, we want to determine also whether or not some of the responses by the government to some of those relevant events that occurred over the course of the year had any effect in that as well. So as we get into waves 2 and 3, as government responses to things like terrorism or race relations, whether or not those things have an increase or decrease in the trust level from the government too. And whether or not we can isolate certain trust factors and distrust factors a little bit further as we go through, something that we'll be identifying during the qualitative phases. In the last month, the majority of the millennials that were part of the study had actually signed a petition for an issue they cared about. So they had taken that sort of first step to do something, much more in a passive activism role. But only about half had actually volunteered or donated to the cause affiliated with the issue in which that they identified. And only about a third of them participated in a demonstration. So it's kind of a lot to take in. So let me break this down a little bit. We have a majority of the people at least doing something in which that they're moving forward and saying to a general population, friends, families, and networks, that they care about a social issue. This is the passive form, right? But only about half of those that did that. So half of the majority that did that actually volunteered or even donated. And if we even look at it, a third overall actually went out and went beyond the petition and demonstrated and did that form of a little bit more intensive activism overall. here's what's really, really important. If you are a nonprofit that executive that's listening to this today, is as we see these social issues and the interest by millennials to have a participatory role in it, we don't see them directly going into the volunteer giving state right now, at least in this first wave of what we're finding. We need to see if it happens in others. We see them taking a passive form, this petition signing, or at least to stand up and be a part of the population and care, but it didn't necessarily equal deeper forms of active involvement going forward. Now, if we break it down even further by gender in the last month, you can see a couple things that males, in the individuals that were in our studies, we had males that actually volunteered more and donated more, supported community projects, and signed petitions were higher as well, and participated in demonstrations. Overall, as part of our study of millennials that we're going through, we actually saw higher male participation cause engagement rates than we did with females, which is something that we need to pay attention to see if that continues to shape out or not. Historically, we had seen the opposite effect in some of our other studies. When we look at it by political ideology, you can see there, if we compare liberals to conservatives, or who identified themselves as those categories, and the level of actual cause engagement, you can see there that on the volunteer side, we have conservative-leaning individuals doing more. We had donations a little bit higher on the conservative side, but yet signing petitions was about equal. Demonstrations was lower for liberals, as well as the community project side. So this is something that we need to determine whether or not that is the case, because there were so many candidates still in place. Maybe some of the social issues that were being discussed didn't lend itself to actual participatory behavior as well. So questions to think through. One is participation in these issues. Do they actually increase or not? We need to go back longitudinally and look through, how does participation look throughout the year from volunteers and rates and donation? And we know that the passive forms of engagements, like I mentioned, like these signing petitions, to the more active, will they actually move there and continue to do more? Or will we see higher rates of passive engagement? This has led to an internal discussion that we have talked about in other research studies, is the redefinition of cause engagement by the individual. Is to say, well, I can be involved in a cause or address a social issue, but do I need to be on site and volunteer or donate to feel as if I'm a part of a population affecting that social issue? So in essence, can I play a leading role without being a donor or volunteer for a cause? That's something, a definition and a framework that we really need to build out over the course of the year. And in particular, when we're looking at our past Millennial Impact Reports, past other data that exists in the research and philanthropy field, whether or not females will remain less engaged than males, is it because it's an election year, or is this just a one-time 3 months that this happened? Because if that's the case, will this election year change and alter the female millennial participation, and what will be the greater effect long term? Trend 7. The majority of millennial respondents had posted something on social media about an issue they cared about in the past week. Again, we saw that passive form of engagement with some sort of social issue or cause. And when we look at it by political ideology, there was some interesting things that also came out. So how many times in the past week have they posted through comments? And we noticed that there were some differences between the liberal and conservative fields. In fact, we had if you look here, the 14% of liberals had posted something 4 to 7 times versus 23%, 1 to 3 times. Liberals had done a little bit more than the conservative-leaning identifiers as well. And we had more conservatives who are posting more in the 8 to 10 times. So some interesting, unique features here. Basically, it comes down that we've seen is that those that identified in these categories is that we saw the few that from a conservative standpoint, those that identified were posting a little bit more frequently on the top end, where then liberals were overall. Which, is this just social media behavior during the election? We don't know. That's something we'll do longitudinally and look through. And Essentially, we need to determine at the end of this study, did we see that conservative-leaning millennials were actually much more active in social media than the liberal-leaning ones? And as we look at signing petitions, which is about equal, they might be taking an action, but maybe they're not sharing or being as larger advocates out in the community. Something we need to determine as to whether or not that stays the course over the next 2 to 3 waves. From March to May, support of Clinton and Trump increased by millennial respondents, while support of Sanders had actually decreased. And we started to see that and it should also be noted that as we went through the months, it was much more clear that statistically speaking, that Bernie Sanders could, based upon how the electoral votes would be there, that he could not potentially be the candidate unless something had dramatically changed within the convention. And as you look here, if you had to cast your vote in that moment, you could see that Clinton's support had actually increased over the course of the months, while Bernie Sanders had increased a little bit in April, but then started to go down. And then we saw the same piece happen with actually Trump. Cruz and Kasich had obviously left the campaigns, but all the others, we could naturally see them starting to increase when it's likelihood that the candidate itself was being selected. And when we are going through this, it did lead us to some additional research questions that we're pondering, which is, do these specific candidates advance or will increase higher percentages to vote either as well? Because we're going to look at some voting trends. But what are the considerations important when selecting the candidates for voting in November? So what is it about the candidates themselves that they're really seeking when they're looking to vote for a particular person? And that's something that we'll be diving deeper into. The number of respondents planning to vote in the election actually increased from March to April, but decreased in May. We are going to try and see if that holds true with our additional millennials that participate in the other waves. But from this first wave, we can say that it actually decreased from March to April, increased, but then decreased. As you can see, are you registered and do you plan to vote? If we look at the registration area alone, it was about equal on the conservative and liberal side, close to it, only 4 percentage points different. Do you plan to vote? We actually saw in the no, liberal category was a little bit higher, unsure. Now, this is what we need to do as we go forward here, as we look to analyze this, is determine, has that changed post-convention? Has it changed pre-convention as where it was? And whether or not voting plans given in the second wave will ultimately alter and change as we go forward. And do conservative and leaning millennials report that they are registered and planning to vote? I mean, why is it the case that those individuals had reported that? And then after we do our post-election piece and qualitative interviews, determining whether or not they actually voted will be another piece in and of itself. And will it actually mean that the individuals that say they're going to come out in the droves as well, or will we not see the voting based upon public discourse, other public events on social issues that could happen? So those were the major 9 trends that we saw. A couple other things to think through as we are going through some of these questions. And by the way, we're going to do a Q&A for about 15 minutes. So feel free to put the question and answer into your question and answer area in the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side, or however you're viewing this. And we'll get to as many questions as we can leading up to the close of the webinar. A couple of things on really what's next and what and how we're looking at it. Overall, there's probably 3 things that is of particular interest to us. One is how is the individual millennial defining being a conservative and being a liberal, or being a neutral party, an independent individual, and whether or not that matches up. The second thing is how are they defining activism? Do we think that we're onto a new form of the way somebody defines being a supporter of a cause? Our historical notion that you are a volunteer or a donor and that you are or will be a supporter then, or does the individual, by doing these more advocacy, activism, smaller passive roles, view themselves that way? What does that mean for the nonprofit sector and field? And has this election in and of itself changed the way that we view participation in social issues? And then lastly, whether or not we can see increases, or whether or not the increase or decrease in actual volunteerism and donation will increase as we get post-election and changes to it. And is all of the discussion on all the other issues, will that drive them to actually do something for those social issues or not? And that's something that we're paying particular attention to as we go through this. So feel free to put in your questions as I talk about what's next and what we're working on. A couple things. We're working on Wave 2 right now. We'll be providing a report on Wave 2 right before the election, of course. And in that, actually before that, in October, we'll be providing that detail, and then we'll be focusing on Wave 3. Our plan is to report right after the election how our research pool performed. And then you'll be able to know in real time. If you have questions, and the study in itself, because again, we're right in the middle of it. This is an opportunity for you to be a part of the research. And if you have questions and things that you think that we haven't thought of, questions that arose from you or what you would like to know, let us know those things. We'll have a post-election day survey, of course, right away. So we'll report as quickly as we can what actually happens and whether or not they voted. Then we're going to validate everything with a bigger interview iterative process there with the qualitative portion. And then in January, we will provide to you a full big report, comprehensive, on what things happened over the course of the months, what relevant events occurred that might have triggered these things, and answers to some of these questions that we posed here in this first wave type of study. So you can keep up with everything by downloading it to millennialimpact.com, of course, and we'll be doing announcements. Make sure you sign up for the updates on that page, as we'll be providing updates to do webinars and sessions like this over the course of the year. So to your questions now, I see that we've got a lot coming in, so feel free to put as many of those questions as you can in there. First and foremost, the question about methodology. What are the education levels and class backgrounds? Yeah, so we had different education levels from, because we're dealing in a couple of things here. One is that when you're looking at the millennial generation population overall, we're talking about those between 18 and roughly the 33 age as of today. And when you look at that, if you take it across that category, you're going to get a little bit more that are actually educated because of the amount of people who are graduating with diplomas. Because if you look at the first cohort of that larger population, the 18 to 24-year-olds, those will be a little bit more into they don't have actual college degrees versus the 25 to the 33 categories. And so we look at the different levels of have some high school or general education, have high school, have taken some college, and have not graduated, and then bachelor's degrees, some graduate work, and so forth. And as you can imagine, the 18 to 24 category is predominantly high school and some college. And then the other categories had primarily bachelor's degrees in it. What is the correlation? Thanks, by the way. And then the class backgrounds of the respondents. This is a geographic representation of the United States, so they were from all over. We do actually have it by region, but are not planning to report that until later on, until after the end, as we continue to build the pool. The next question was there a correlation between income and conservatives? Not necessarily. In terms of income levels, we can look at education and ideology, but we did not look at it from an income perspective. But worth noting, something that we can go back to. Thanks, Genevieve, for that question. The question is, Derrick, do you sense a shift in millennials once they are married and family? The thought is that their priorities and engagement shift. Yeah, actually, there's some interesting data, Harold, on this question, and we've noted this throughout our data and in others in previous reports. There's actually two primary life cycle changes that what we would say influence the behavior dramatically of the millennial as they go through the formative years. And that is when the person is economically on their own for the first time. And then the second one is actually marriage is up there, but not as strong as when they actually have their first child. And so when that is they have a dependent beyond that's solely dependent upon their financial. Marriage is up there too. So it's a 3 and 4 category influencer. But when we look at young people in first marriage, not necessarily, they may or may not have children. It's the children piece in which they have a fully dependent child. So those two things definitely inspire the change in engagement shift. We also see that engagement tends to dip a little bit in primary priorities, and this is something we've noted in previous studies, that priorities in those formative stages tend to be very low, and then as they become more comfortable, we see their priorities through the lens of family as well. And the next one is the question around, if we work with organizations of both C3s and C4s, what should our strategy be around fundraising for millennials? Should we focus on raising dollars from these constituencies or not? I think what's really interesting, Holly, and thanks for the question here, is that what we've identified, and this is something you should note that we'll continue to break down, but something that I have as the lead researcher on the Millennial Impact Project for years been thinking through is that is the individual, how does the individual view themselves as a constituent? And they would never use that term, right? They would never say, I'm a constituent of this or I'm that. And what I think is important here is to say that we have people willing to voice opinion for or against a social issue or a social cause. Where we see the disconnect is moving those people to do more. And the fundraising part of it is a part of the ongoing actionable piece. But we need to get the individual to continue to do more for the issue so that they self-actualize the importance of it and not as an episodic opportunity. So as a C3 or a C4, the conversation you should have right now is, how can we get people performing more acts for this social issue, and then bringing in the money part, the volunteers, and higher expectation level pieces. We have to look at the holistic individual, and over the years we started to note the trend that the individual wants to stand up and do something. Their brain, of course, works in a path of least resistance. How can I stand up, do little at times? How can I do more when I'm really impassioned for it? And the organization has to be set for a model that says you can do these small acts leading up to larger and progressively move you there. So do I think you should focus on raising dollars? I think dollars is part of a larger constituent involvement to get the person to act. I think you need the person to act, and what we're clearly seeing is that the dollars leading through is not necessarily the way that they're going. So an interesting note from I think it's more of a comment. It says, Derrick, you appear to be charting some of the disenfranchisement of the electorate, hence Bernie's increased support. Yes, that could possibly be there. I think this is a first wave when there were so many candidates in there, right? I think second wave is going to be really, really telling. And in particular, August, starting our next wave of study in August, now that the two are actually selected. It's tough to get perception, and as when you still have candidates who are in the pool, or at least perceive that there are candidates in the pool, whether or not they can, according to their own parties, be an actual candidate or not. And so now that it is very definitive as to who those candidates are, does that disenfranchise actually happen? I don't know, but that's why I think wave 2 will be more important too as well. So a question again on the geographic. Tammy, thanks again. We actually had it is geographically dispersed throughout the United States, and we'll be breaking the geographies down in more waves as we go forward. So yes, that is right. We didn't include it in this one either. The next one is, will wave 3 questions be more reflected to find out what they were thinking back during wave 1 and 2 phases? So we actually need to remain, most of the questions need to remain constant, right? Or otherwise we've got to make a notation that's actually in the piece that we shifted questions based on that. That's not necessarily a short-term longitudinal advisement that we would recommend, but we will be going back and doing a qualitative on those individuals to dive deeper, of course, on that. The next one is that, will you use the same cohort for each wave? Are there going to be new respondents? Yeah, we're actually doing not the same respondents overall. And we chose that method for two particular reasons. We wanted to see whether or not that these new pools of people each and every month had any consistency across the board. And now we will be following up with each individuals within these waves to determine how they ended in the end. But each month is different, so we can bring in new individuals to see whether or not this has changed and whether or not is it just this population or what's the aggregate overall. There's still a trend overall, so that's why we didn't use the same ones. When we report on cause engagement rates, here's a question: males as higher than females. Was that specific to a political involvement or to all causes? Well, we had two slides in particular, Danielle, that we shared in that piece, and in that particular area, what we found is that the millennials that were part of wave one, actually, we had more males just in general. And then you can see on the conservative side, we have a little bit more conservative. So we didn't actually look at it as female conservative or male conservative or female liberal, male liberal, but something that we can note for our reports later going forward. Because I do know that there are some that are very interested in determining whether or not gender and political leaning has an effect or not on cause engagement. And the other thing too is I think that as we look at the participants that actually come through, it's important to note as well as what age categories they're in, right? So because we use the word millennial and others use it so broadly, we're looking at the aggregate overall, but we're also going to see changes in those that are between the 18 to 24 categories. And the other thing too is those that are in the postgraduate day or post-university days, and those that even have children too, whether or not that would actually change. The next question is around how did you pool the participants, also in the questions links engagement. So there's a couple of questions in here, sorry. Let me get to all of them. One of the questions is, how did you pool the participants for the study? Yeah, so we do a sourcing method where the individual has to pre-qualify based upon indicators and quota methods based upon their demographic characteristics, education characteristics, so as to represent as much as possible the millennial generation. And so those are sourced nationwide through many different means. Usually Lightspeed is the group that we work through to do that. Also in the questions linking engagement to ideology, did the questions take into account only politics, donations to political campaign, or did it take nonprofit into account as well? Yeah, so in the engagement to ideology, it was primarily, we only looked at it from the nonprofit side of it. We didn't look at it from whether or not they donated to the political campaign, because we wanted to know whether or not somebody was leaning any other way, how that affected on the cause behavior, which is essentially where we have with the Millennial Impact research. Now, over time, of course, we can actually go into whether or not they donated to a political campaign as we get to some of the ideology or some of the qualitative interview phases too as well. And is there a correlation? Somebody had asked here, another question is there an actual correlation between those that actually vote in the question is around voting. Do you anticipate there being a correlation, or do you think that these numbers will hold true to voting patterns in the end? Essentially, I am saying, do you think the millennial will vote how they say they're going to vote right now? That's a crystal ball question. I don't know. Recently we had a chance to, or at least briefly talk with Rock the Vote and a couple other places that are looking at voting trends in voting registration. And I think what we need to get at, which is also somebody else had asked this in another presentation that I had done, is do you think disenfranchisement will also mean that people just won't come out and vote? Do you think millennials are in that category? Although they're registered, will they actually vote in the end? According to our first wave, that was March, April, May, and there was some fluidity yet in the Republican side, and there was some in the Democratic side, although towards the end, as you can see, as we noted, that it was unlikely that Bernie could be the candidate based upon the party rules. That I think we're going to know more in wave two whether or not the voting is going to get close to where it is. And there are also events, and there are things that the candidates say, there are things that the candidates perform and do, there are moves that they make that will also influence that voting behavior. So it's really hard to determine and to say that all of the people who are registered are likely going to vote. Obviously, that is not necessarily the case that we see in wave one, but determining whether or not those actually come through will be very, very interesting. The other question that we got is around in the two candidates, Hillary and Trump, that are today. What would you say to us as a nonprofit who's trying to gather attention on millennials in the light of these candidates are bringing up social issues that may or may not address what we're working on? How would you get their attention as a nonprofit? So I think that's a unique opportunity. Obviously, what is happening is the candidates are bringing up social issues. They're having discussions on social topics, and obviously they're saying, "Vote for me." That's how I can address it for you and with you. And in terms of you as a nonprofit, that's a chance to say, "This is what you can do right now." And I think the challenge, and it kind of goes back to the cause engagement, does an election cycle mean that an election year mean that we're going to have smaller involvement in causes? I would hope it would be the opposite, in that these candidates are bringing up social issues and nonprofits are there taking that relevant discussion and saying, here's how you can act right now. Here's what you can do. And I mentioned this into a discussion I was having with some media individuals as we were previewing the research to them, is to say that this is the opportunity for nonprofit causes to say, thank you so much for that interest and passion in a social issue. Here's what you can do to take the next step. That's where I would spend the energy, not necessarily waiting back to the end of the election, because what, in essence, the candidates have done is surfaced individual preference towards social issues and preference and attitudes, positive or negative, on that issue. And if you're working on that issue, there's a chance for you to take those people who are signing up and doing these passive forms and social media engagement or petition signing, those kinds of things, as your opportunity to lead them to do even more. So hopefully that would be an opportunity for you. Well, we always end about 5 till, and a couple notation things here. One is thank you for all of your questions. We'll be sending out this piece, and you can track the progress of the research as we go through it at themillennialimpact.com. We'll also be releasing the next wave. Wave 2 will happen in the October before the election, and we'll be releasing wave 3 and what also happens at the election right after, and then in January. So make sure you sign up for the alerts. If you have any other questions or have any suggestions, please do let us know as we're going through the research iteration process. We really appreciate the time that you spent today with us and look forward to the next time we can share our results from Wave 2. Take care.